Hello, welcome to the Offshoot, and I'm the host, Lee Sean Nelson. I have a returning guest, Reverend Hagler, and we're going to talk about something that has been on my mind for quite some time now, and that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over in Israel. There's a lot that I don't know, and there's a lot I think that you all do not know, but I also think that the bigger issue is what is the involvement, or why should Black Americans be involved in this conflict? There's been a lot out there from some people asking why have they not seen more support from the Black community. So we're going to talk about that today, and we're going to also get some history. So welcome my guest, Reverend Hagler. Reverend Hagler, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's good to be here with you. Great to see you again, Sean.
Likewise, likewise. You are so well informed when it comes to many issues, but with this particular issue, I wanted to talk to you because you have been writing about this issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So tell us your thoughts on the conflict itself.
Well, it's really a human rights issue as well as a social justice issue, and really an issue of racism that we're battling against white supremacy in all of its manifestations.
And I'm assuming you're referring to white supremacy in the form of the Israeli government, those being the ones who are perpetrating white supremacy over that of Palestinians. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's been a very colonial settler relationship because basically you're talking about Europeans who've come into the land that was given to them by somebody who was not in the land, like the British. Basically, may open that territory and say, okay, a Jewish homeland. Jewish homeland for folks who are coming out of the concentration camps in Europe. And yes, the whole Holocaust in Europe was a horrible, horrendous tragedy.
It's real.
Nobody takes away from that. But the reality is, you can't make amends for one tragedy by perpetuating another tragedy against another people. And we got to remember that this is very much a European paradigm, that you go in other countries, you take over, you feel that you have a right, whether you call it manifest destiny, or whether you say we're biblically chosen, it comes out to mean the same thing. That you have one group asserting its sense of superiority over another group. And that's what we've been dealing with.
Thank you. But should we clarify or get some more clarity? Now, what you're referring to, isn't that more coming from the Zionist movement or the Zionists within the Jewish community, the Israeli community, versus the overall Israeli population itself? And also with that, didn't the Zionist movement start out of Eastern Europe right before or during the Ottoman Empire?
It started there as a kind of a concept that picked up steam, and particularly picked up steam with the Nazi pogroms that took place, the concentration camps, the rounding up of Jews. But you got to talk about Israel as this manifestation that doesn't get started in contemporary times, doesn't get started until 1948.
After the 3 Days War.
48, right? Which was basically the British, that can be a Jewish homeland.
Okay, the British and the French, you say, right?
British and the French. The French were up in Lebanon. British mandate, because they ended up with the land from the Ottoman Empire out of World War I, interpreting it as the spoils of war. 1917, it ends up under the mandate of the British and to some degree the French. And so they break up the Ottoman Empire and basically control territories. And as the Zionist movement gained steam in Europe, particularly after World War II, their argument to called the Zionist argument to the Western world was, we are people without a land, and Palestine is a land without a people, even though there were millions of people in the land.
Yeah, there are millions of Palestinians. There are millions, whether there were a minority of Jewish people who were there were Christians who were there. So how do they make their argument to the European imperialists, particularly the British and the French? Why do they buy into that argument from the Zionists who, like you say, come from mostly Eastern European, Ukraine, Hungary, Poland, etc.?
But Sean, it's the same argument as Columbus discovering America.
Okay.
Even though there were people already all throughout the Caribbean, the Americas, right, that were indigenous. But they didn't matter. They didn't matter. It took someone sailing from Europe to make the discovery.
Yeah.
And that's the narrative that gets told over and over again, as if there was no culture, as if there was no history, no civilizations that existed.
It was already there.
Right? And they did the same thing with Africa at the Berlin Conference. When at the Berlin Conference, spread out a map of the African continent.
Divided it up.
Right? And all of the leaders of Europe were there. And they said, you can have this, we'll take this, we'll control that, we'll award you that, to keep them from going to war with each other over African territories. It's the same type of colonialism, the same type of racism, the same type of disregard for history, for people and populations.
And people don't seem to know that history when it comes to the conflict. Now, you hear both sides of the argument. Like you said, you hear the theories, you hear the arguments from the Zionists, you hear the talk of, okay, the promised land, in terms of biblical doctrine, if you will. So what is one to who are we to, as Black Americans, I should say, who should we give our support to when we understand that there's a Zionist movement, we understand colonialism, we understand European imperialism and how that affected us even to this very, very day, okay? And we're seeing it playing out again, as you say, in Israel. Where are we as Black Americans? Where are we to go? I mean, who are we to believe in? Because it could all be propaganda from both sides. Okay.
Well, obviously, we're to believe in the liberation of people. Right? Liberation is not found in supremacist ideology.
Mm-hmm.
Supremacist ideology are automatically the oppressors and the aggressors.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That gives you that sort of idea of your privilege, of your importance over everybody else. We have to remember this, is that Israel aided and advised the white minority ruled government in Southern Africa. So that Nelson Mandela and others recognized the Palestinian struggle because it was comparable to their struggle. And the Palestinians recognized the Black South African struggle as being comparable to their struggle.
There was apartheid in Israel as well. So the Palestinians were under apartheid, just like
That's why every major human rights organization in the world has termed what is going on in Israel as apartheid. If folk don't know what that means, that's segregation. If folk don't know what that means if you were born in South Carolina, right, at a certain time, you had to step off the sidewalk when a white person passed.
Yeah.
And you were denied education. And you were denied all of the other privileges and benefits of citizenship.
Yeah.
That's what's going on in Israel. except it's on steroids.
So why do you say that? Why do you say it's on steroids?
Because it's been going on for 75 years. There's been no international outcry. People have not recognized Palestinians as being human beings. Just like October 7th, as horrible as it was, the world was outraged over the killing of an Israeli. And we should be outraged over the killing and taking of any life, whether in Israel or whether here on the streets of Washington, D.C. But the reality is, nobody's wept and wailed for 75 years of Palestinian oppression, Palestinian dehumanization, and the apartheid system that has tried to crush Palestinians into non-existence.
Yeah, because I wonder, because people haven't been protesting and screaming about the Uyghurs in China. They haven't been doing the same thing regarding the South Sudanese in Sudan. They haven't been doing the same things in terms of what happened in Myanmar or Burma, depending on where you stand on that whole issue. So why do you think that in this situation where we had similar incidences around the world, like I said, in Sudan and China with the Uyghurs, and in Burma or Myanmar, why this one is a situation where there is so much great anger on both sides?
Let me turn that back around. Folks were upset over the Ukraine. They hung flags, had marches, wanted funding. What was the difference?
Well, Ukrainians are Caucasian.
They were human beings. And what they were praising the Ukrainians for is exactly what Palestinians have been doing. Attempting to resist.
A stronger power.
A stronger power. Resist the being wiped out.
Okay.
Right? And the fact is that in the Ukraine, grandmothers were praised.
Yeah.
In Palestine, nobody raised a whimper.
But that's just so wild and ironic in so many ways, because a lot of Zionists, like I said, that movement, a big part of it, some of those early thinkers, if you will, of the Zionist idea came out of Ukraine.
Yeah.
So it really is a conundrum when I kind of think about it, because you have the Ukrainians who get a lot of support. And again, that's like a Caucasian, but some Zionists came out of there, and they were part, again, they partnered with the British and the French to create a state for Jews, which is now Israel, which is where they are now. And they've moved more toward the right with their politics and their government. So you have, I guess I'm assuming, again, correct me if I'm wrong, the lineage of Caucasian Zionists who are in Israel, who were oppressed in Ukraine, but now seem to be doing the same thing to Palestinians in Israel. Am I getting that right?
Well, it's not just Ukraine. Folks came out of Germany and Poland, Russia, Ukraine, just all over Europe, and basically came in to the area, because we forget that there were always Jews in the land, and Muslims and Christians.
Yes.
And Jerusalem was supposed to be a multi-religious city.
Yeah.
Where the faiths came together, right? And so that had been there because it was recognized from the Abrahamic faiths as being sort of the birthplace and a very principled place in terms of the origins and the foundations of our religious movements. But what happens is that if you come in with an idea that You're more important. Your issues are more important. The pain that you experience is more important than anybody else's pain.
Yeah.
If that becomes your mentality, then you can justify the pain and subjugation that you inflict on other people. It's a kind of strange post-traumatic stress that usually, but in this case, it takes victimhood and infuses a superiority into it.
Yeah, in therapy, they will say that that person's projecting their insecurities onto someone else.
Yeah.
So how do you think we got here? How did it get to where it is now? Because like you said, Jerusalem was a place where you had the melting pot of cultures and religion, and there wasn't much of an issue. You had Arabs alongside Persians and alongside Christians and all of that and so forth. And now there seems to be this great divide that some people fear that it could lead to a third world war.
Remember this, you got a problem. Anytime any place refers to itself as a Jewish state, that means that if you're not Jewish, you have second and third class citizenship. It's just like any place that refers to itself as a Christian state or an Islamic state. If you're not that, where are you?
You're a second class citizen.
Automatically, just by the definition of your national identity. That's why we have to struggle against Christian nationalism in this country. That's why. Because, it comes down to whose Christianity are we talking about?
Yes.
Right? So, folk can talk about we're a Christian nation all they want. But most of the people I see saying that are not folks that I'm ever going to agree with in terms of Christianity. So I don't want them to defining for me what that is. They want me to be a second class citizen because they want their religious paradigm to be more superior and over everybody else's. That's why we got to reject it, and reject it. A pluralistic society means exactly that.
Yeah.
It's a mixture.
Yeah.
It's diverse, right? It's full.
Yeah.
It's not narrow. And that's the problem.
Yeah. So we have to reject it everywhere, not just in our backyards, is what you're saying. So we see it happening elsewhere. We should reject it there before it happens here, because it could happen here. And we've already saw that it almost happened here. We had the incident of January 6th, where a lot of those folks were, quote, Christian, end quote.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was their brand of Christianity that they want to impose on all the rest of us.
Despite the fact that this country was not founded as a religious nation at all.
That's right.
So is that why Black Americans should really pay more attention to what's going on here? You spoke to the fact that we should care because it's a humanitarian issue more than anything else. And you're right. People are people. I have friends who are Jewish. I have friends who are Palestinian, and I have friends who are Arab, and I have friends who are Persian. And there's a difference. People don't. If you don't know this, not you, but people. If you don't know this, Persians are not Arabs, and they will argue to death that they are not Arabs. So why is it? What do we as Black Americans should be aware of? I mean, you mentioned the humanitarian aspect of it, but you also mentioned that we don't want someone putting their form of Christianity on us, which is the goal of some people. Is that why we should be really focused on what's happening over there, and in that, what we should be supporting the Palestinians wholeheartedly, and I'm not referring to Hamas, I'm referring to the Palestinian people.
But let me hold on, because nobody wants to say this. But if you ever tried to organize anybody into anything, when people are satisfied, happy, and contented. They ain't coming. It is only out of the context that an Hamas is able to emerge. It is only out of a context of being deprived and dispossessed and oppressed that Hamas is able to emerge. If you want to deal with Hamas, it's not through bombs, it's through justice. You want to deal with Hamas, it's through creating a paradigm of justice and hope for Palestinians and sovereignty for Palestinians, right? Because basically extremist ideology always finds legs when people create an extreme environment. And Gaza has been an open air prison because of the Israeli blockade. That blockade didn't just happen. That blockade has been in effect really since 2005.
Yeah.
Right. So you and most of the world now has agreed that Gaza was the largest open air prison in the world. I have a friend who's Gazan right now, Christian, here in DC, that has not been allowed to return home to see her mother. Just put out last night that her mother and family were staying in the church in which she was baptized, the Orthodox church that was bombed. All the heat is out. The light is out.
Well, she's Christian then.
These are Christians. Yep. And a woman who had watched over her decided to venture through the streets to get some clothes and was gunned down by IDF soldiers and bled to death in the streets. Right? And that's just one story. But that's what's going on. The fact is, and no matter how you cut it, Zionism is equal to Christian nationalism, is equal to white supremacy, is equal to hatred.
I have not heard anyone say it like that before. And hearing what you said previously, it does make sense. I can see the link between all of them because there are some common ideologies within all of those.
It's an ideology that tries to exert its superiority over everybody else. And once you do that, it's what we dealt with. Enslaved, Reconstruction, after Reconstruction, on up to where we are right now, where we got somebody who kneels on George Floyd's throat and chokes the life out of him. Why are we looking at Gaza? Israeli settlers are clearing out the Palestinian villages at gunpoint.
Yeah.
Because they've been given guns by the Israeli government and allowed to go on a rampage. That's what's going on right now in the West Bank as we look at the genocide that is going on right now in Gaza.
Well, and there have been some notable people, celebrities, who tried to call out members of the Black community for not being more vocal about what's going on in Israel and Palestine, accusing some members of the Black community of being more pro-Palestinian versus pro-Israel, accusing some Black people of being supporters of Hamas when they actually were more support of Palestinian people. And then there's also a divide within the Israeli community itself. And then not all Israelis support the war itself as well. So who is to gain from these atrocities? And I'm going to say on both sides.
Well, it's hard for me to say both sides because one's been going on for 75 years.
Okay.
So there's not a balance to the argument.
Well, I can see that because Israel definitely, I mean, Israel has nuclear weapons and Palestine does not.
It's just like you could talk about 1,200 people killed in October 7th versus over 11,000 Palestinians in Gaza today. Where's the balance?
There is
1,200 over 11,000. And the majority of these on the 11,000 are children.
Yeah, the pictures have been horrific, and I saw some of the pictures, and it's kind of hard to look at all of that. Do you think that Hamas puts Palestinians in harm's way?
Hamas is really not in the formula.
Okay.
Hamas may have carried out the attack on October 7th, which everybody agrees they did.
Yeah.
But this has not been a war against Hamas. No matter how they bill it. I look at CNN talking about Israel-Hamas war. Well, for Israel-Hamas war, how come children are being killed?
Yeah.
How come civilians are being killed?
And how, like you said earlier, like how Christians have been caught in the crossfire.
Christians, Muslims, agnostics, everybody. Women, children, medical personnel. Over 40 journalists have been killed.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's what I'm getting at. It's sort of like, this is not a war against Hamas. This is a genocide of Palestinian people.
Yeah.
Now, they will argue that point because they're good at arguing and putting things in the formula. Like, for example, they say, if you for a ceasefire, then you must be for Hamas. I've not heard anybody say that they're for Hamas. But I've heard some people say that they want to stop the killing.
Yeah.
And they want to stop the killing of Palestinian children, Palestinian civilians, just like they want to stop the killing of Israeli civilians. Stop the killing. But Netanyahu and the settlers seeing this as an opportunity to sweep the land clean.
But I was about to ask you that question because
and to annex Gaza.
Yeah, and that comes up a lot because you know, on the pro-Israel side, a lot of folks are saying that this is not about land. This is not about taking land. Okay, but of course, when I think about the history in this country, the United States, and of course, me personally, I've been from South Carolina. I know for a fact that land was taken from Black people, and it's still happening to this very, very day.
I remember it wasn't about land then either.
Exactly, it wasn't about land then, but now we know that it was always about land. Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, then so it is about land.
It's about land. It's about how do you create a homogeneous country? How do you deal with, as they would say, the Palestinian problem?
Well, that is really kind of wild because isn't that what China tried to do, was to create a homogeneous country?
That's all the sickness of superiority.
Which never works.
That's the disease in it.
Yeah.
Right? Like Hitler and them talked about the Jewish problem.
Yeah.
Right? George Wallace and them talked about the Negro problem.
Yeah.
Israel talks about the Palestinian problem.
Yeah.
And then makes the statement that they need to be supported because they live, and Netanyahu has said this, because they live in a bad neighborhood.
Well,
does that sound familiar?
Sounds very, very familiar. I mean, that sounds like the playbook right out of the GOP, the Republican Party of this country, and the old Dixiecrats of this country.
That's right. Gentrification. You move into the bad neighborhood.
Yeah.
Before long, you made the neighborhood your neighborhood. And the bad elements that you identified no longer exist, nor do their history.
Yeah. But it never works because there's always opposition to it. So I fail to understand, why do they continue to do the same thing over and over again when there's so many examples throughout history where it has never come to fruition the way that they had hoped and planned?
Because it's an insanity.
Mm.
It's like what we always say,
Yeah.
that insanity is doing the same old thing and expecting different results.
Yeah, exactly. And this seems to be a really good example of insanity. But a lot of Black people, a lot of Black Americans are not saying too much about the conflict. They are quietly saying this or that, like even within my own family, who are not the most international when it comes to following international news and politics. They are very aware of what's going on, and they have their thoughts, and they won't say
Yeah.
something because it's almost as if their thinking is, I have no dog in this fight. Okay. But you think that we should have a dog in this fight. Is that correct?
Well, there's a number of levels. One is that there's been such a blackmail, and I use that word deliberately,
Mhm.
of the Black community. And what I mean by that is that people have lost jobs as anchor persons and journalists,
Yes, I know you're referring to.
right? Because they've talked about Palestine. Teachers have lost positions teaching. I know a young woman graduated from school. They went back and looked at her Facebook and saw that she was in pro-Palestinian demonstrations. Took her job,
Mm.
right? Instantly. No due process. Just took a job. You know, when we look at what has gone on in terms of the argument that the ADL and others have put out, that we were there with you for the civil rights movement, and Black Lives Matter has turned against the Jewish community. And we're going to remember that. You know, that's been part of the argument. And then recently, in this episode, the ADL has said to Jews and to rabbis, if you call for a ceasefire,
Mhm.
you're then an anti-Semitic Jew.
But that's kind of contradictory. Why would you basically calling Jewish people self-hating because they want a ceasefire?
Right? From the group that has been entrusted to protect the Jewish community from defamation. So they turn around and they defame members of the Jewish community because they don't agree with their Zionist ideology.
Yeah. It's so bizarre, and I wonder if more folks of diverse backgrounds, diverse cultures will come together to try to bring to light some of the things that you're saying here. Because I wonder about how did this thing happen? How did October 7th come about? Because Israel supposedly had the most advanced intelligence operation in the entire world. Okay. And I fail to understand how a country that is so advanced, probably that one that rivals the US, could let something like this happen. Okay. I've heard all kinds of conspiracy theories about insider information, et cetera, and so forth, but I still fail to understand, um, knowing uh, the facts that there was a time when the Israeli government supported Hamas, not politically and financially, and then now we're at a point where they're at war. Uh, I'm trying to make all that jive.
I mean, the settler mentality in Israel thought that Hamas was a good choice.
Over the PLO, the Palestinian Authority.
over the PA, right? Because Hamas was something you could rail against.
Mm-hmm.
It was your boogeyman.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime you had a crisis about your own improprieties as leaders of governments in Israel, you could always point to your boogeyman,
yeah,
and get people off the subject. And the whole thing is that we have bought, as Americans, into great Israeli propaganda and narratives.
well, this country gives a lot of money to Israel, and ours has given a lot of money to it. I mean,
If they closed the government, if they had closed the government, Israel would still get funded.
Yeah, well, some Americans would be out of a job.
Right.
And I don't think a lot of Americans, including Black Americans, also know that there are Black Jews in Israel, and there are Black Palestinians in Israel, and they have been left out of the discussion. You don't hear their stories, you don't see their faces at all. And we also know that there have been incidences in Israel where Black Jews felt discriminated against, where there have been like police shootings, if you will, of Black Jews in Israel. Of course, most of them coming from East Africa. So these stories aren't out there at all. But I feel like those stories should be out there because they are part of the narrative. Okay. Now, do you think that if more of us knew these stories, people who look like you and I, that they'd be more inclined to speak out and get more involved in what's going on?
One thing that we have to struggle against is the narrative of the church.
Okay.
That basically says this: the promised land, and they're the chosen people. And the church has gone along with that. And we misread scripture, and we take it out of context, and we don't understand the history of scripture. But we preach these things based on some erroneous assumptions, such as Israel ceased to exist during the 7th century BC.
Mm-hmm.
Hear me now. 7th century BC.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Hebrew was a dead language, was only resurrected as part of the Zionist project to try to create hegemony.
Mm.
Right? It was a dead language.
Yeah.
Did not exist from the 7th century BC
Wow.
onward to 1948. That would be like me and you going back to Zimbabwe. Yeah. And bring everybody back with us and just take it over and say, the hell with all of you who've been here. We're here now. Right? And we would say, oh, we left this land 4 centuries ago. Mm-hmm. Now we're back.
And we want it.
Though there may not be little DNA relationship to our roots in that land.
Mm. So
it's like when I talked to an Israeli friend of mine, Miko Pelet, who wrote the book General Sun.
Okay.
And I was doing an interview with him, and I said, Miko, when did your people leave the Middle East? Mm-hmm. And he goes, we never left the Middle East. We're from Russia.
Yeah.
People don't understand that's the narrative. Even when you look at Henry Louis Gates, he does a little slick semantics where he goes to somebody and he says, you're 100% Ashkenazi. as if that's the Middle East, when that's Poland or Germany, that whole region.
Yeah.
Have got nothing to do with the Middle East. But it is folks who buy into a narrative. Just like as Christians, we bought into a narrative.
Yeah.
So we could say Jerusalem is our homeland. But that doesn't make it right.
Yeah. So, of course, before the 3 Days War, okay, 80 years ago, of course, the country of Israel didn't exist, okay, and you had a lot of countries over there didn't exist. So like you said, after the First World War, the spoils of war, the European imperialists divided up the territory, but there was thousands of years ago, you had the Philistines. But what now? Please educate me here because I might get this wrong. But wasn't the word Palestine a derogatory term for Philistines, or or isn't Palestine a derivative of Philistines?
Philistia.
Bithynia? Okay.
Yeah, it was Palestine.
Yeah. Okay.
Those are the people. That's what Rome recognized. That's what all these different empires that came through. And why is the land so significant? It's really not that significant.
Okay.
But it serves as a land bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa.
Yeah. Which is why the British and the French wanted to get rid of the Ottoman Empire.
Right. And that's why the Romans wanted it. And that's why the Babylonians wanted it.
Yeah.
Right? So, the whole thing is, it has always been a teeming cauldron of peoples, cultures, histories, language. It's just that when folks buy into a narrative and it becomes your religious identity, somehow that religious identity rises above the history and the complexities of culture.
So how do we change that narrative for not just Black Americans, but starting with us, our people? How do we change that narrative? You mentioned the church, etc. But that narrative is almost ingrained because we've been hearing it.
We've been hearing it, but we need to examine it. We need to ask ourselves, if somebody else is the chosen people of God, then who the hell are we?
Yeah, it makes no sense because then, aren't we all God's chosen people? Aren't we all from God's creation?
That's what I'm getting at. And we act as if God somehow is a real estate agent.
Yeah, that's true.
God says, I'm going to give you this corner.
Yeah.
Right? And it's going to be yours forever. I don't care where you go. I don't care what you change your name to. It's yours. And I don't care who's there. It's yours.
Yeah.
And as I said to somebody just last night, they said, well, what about, I said, well, what about this? If you're writing the story, don't you think that you're going to write yourself as the central character in the story?
Oh, absolutely. I certainly would.
That's what happened.
Wow. So, and I can go on and on and on and on with this, but I know that our time is not unlimited. So I really hope that all people, but particularly again, Black Americans, which is the focus of this podcast, really hear what you're saying, because you're giving out some really valuable information regarding the history and the current politics and this and that. And so, but I also think, like you're saying, it's that narrative, and the propaganda that we continue to get from imperialism, if you will. but that's a powerful machine.
Yeah.
Like you said, people have lost their jobs for saying just what you and I are talking about.
I mean, I got a couple pieces coming out. And one of the pieces I first set foot in Israel, Palestine in 1974 as an archaeology student.
Okay.
There was tension in the land. It was just 7 years after the 67 war.
Mm-hmm.
And the bottles of Coca-Cola, still red, bottled in occupied Jordan.
Mm.
But travel through the countryside was possible with relatively few checkpoints and disruptions.
Yeah.
I traveled to many places. There was tension in the land, but also relative ease of movement. I did not return to that region until 2014, which is 40 years later, with a delegation of Black cultural artists. The snapshot I carried in my mind for 40 years was confronted with the images of heavy militarization, a separation wall, flashbacks of segregation from my own experiences in Baltimore, and apartheid that I fought against in the struggle to dismantle it in South Africa.
And you saw the same thing in Israel.
Yep, exact same thing. And the thing that kept coming to my mind was George Wallace at his inauguration declaring segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. But the reality is those demons are slayed. Wallace is no more.
Yeah.
Though it's not perfect, by and large, we dismantled apartheid in this country.
But we still have a ways to go.
We still got a ways to go. But there's the struggle that's going on in the world, such as in Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
That's unfinished business.
Yeah.
You know, just like it was like our relationship with South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully it was not just because they were Black, but because they were facing the same conditions, if not worse, than we had faced. Same thing in Rhodesia, that's now Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
Same thing in Angola.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing in Kenya.
Yeah.
On and on, all across the continent. The battle still rages. That's got to be our concern.
Yeah.
Because see, we're not local people.
Yeah.
We're international. Because we stand on just about every mass of earth on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
Because as we were transmitted around the world to rob us of our talents, the fact is that we became a creature born on all these different soils,
Yeah.
and therefore called to be guardians of setting the world right.
That's interesting you say that, and I can certainly buy into that. And I thinking about it, yes, we should be guardians of the world. I've always had this belief that until in this country, the U.S.A, until our government does right by Black Americans in this country and Native Americans, nothing would be right around the world with other people of color, okay, Black, Latino, Palestinian, etc. And so I do believe it has to start here because we are the most powerful country on the earth. And I feel like we could do more, but yeah, so if we are to be guardians, where do we start? Do we start with changing the narrative? Do we start by getting more involved in spreading the message? Do we start by educating people? Do we start in the church and and having ministers give a more realistic perspective of what's going on. So, yeah, how do we activate our duties and responsibilities to be guardians of people of color around the world to against European imperialism that still exists apparently?
I think it's all those things. We got to operate everywhere. We got to turn out churches into grassroots academies where history is taught, where understanding of political equations are taught, right? Because when you look at it, the church can be free,
Yeah,
just like the masjid can be free to teach, to educate, to create an informed populace.
yeah,
We got to start every place, but also recognize that if we allow the cancer of white supremacy, and Zionism is white supremacy, if we allow that cancer to continue to spread, then we're not safe here. And if folks want to understand exactly what that means, we elected a black president. Some of us may have had disagreements with him, but we elected a black president.
yeah.
When Netanyahu came here, he didn't even stop by to ask that president permission to go to Congress.
He bypassed Barack Obama, which
That's right.
protocol. Yes. Mm-hmm.
That was a way of using the N word. And that's what he did. And if we don't understand that, then we will never get it. That mentality, that's the mentality that we're dealing with. Doesn't matter whether you're elected president of the United States.
Yeah.
To those folks, you are still that N word.
In other words,
right? And we saw it rise up in this country. We saw it with other leaders of other nations in relationship. And what I'm getting at is that it is a cancer that we have to stomp it out wherever it is and recognize that it's like a malignancy that grows. It will contaminate everything if we don't destroy it. And if we're not vigilant in our destruction of that mentality of racism, white supremacy, and hatred.
Wow. I don't think I could say anything behind that is more motivating. That's a very motivating speech. I hope people hear that. I'm motivated. Um, that's why I want to have you on. I love, truly, deep down, love talking with you, hearing from you, being educated by you, and I hope that people get the same um, from you that I get from you. So, Reverend Hagler, thank you so much.
Thank you, my brother.
Thank you, and let's stay in touch and do this again.
Gotcha.
You have a good night.